Mount Denali, a name that translates to the Great One, a fitting title for a mountain standing at 20,320 feet, making it the tallest peak in all of North America. After the Group of Four or the Staeheli Expedition reached the summit, they would soon realize the harsh reality of the Great One. A story about survival at all costs, even if that means the sacrifice of others. This is their story. Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel where we cover all tragic and terror stories. So if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, plus ring the notification bell to be notified of all new uploads. Now, let's get into today's story. On May 11, 2011, Mount Denali was cold, especially at the high camp of 17,200 feet. The team of 6, Jerry O'Sullivan, Dave Staeheli, Beat Niederer, Lawrence Cutler, Tony Diskin, and Henry Munter had been resting for 2 days at the high camp, waiting for the weather to present an opportunity to attempt a summit. But today was that day. Although it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the group would take the opportunity with only a slight breeze outside their camp. They were expecting harsh winds later in the day and may not get another chance. You see, what made Mount Denali one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, much less North America, was not only the size, the treacherous glaciers, risk of avalanches, high altitude sickness, but above all else, the location. The mountain is in the northern latitude of the world, making it not only extremely cold, but unpredictable. One morning, the skies could be clear and sunny, and within hours, an entirely different landscape would be outside. Whiteout blizzards, where you would not be able to see your hand if you held it right in front of your face. Staeheli, along with the other group members, knew this, and on the morning of May 11th, they jumped on what could be their only opportunity to summit the mountain. Staeheli, along with Munter, were guides for the mountain trip, who was one of 6 companies that were allowed to guide expeditions up the mountain. The original group that set out was made up of 9 members, 6 clients and 3 guides. However, one member had descended after climbing halfway up the mountain with another expedition that was on their way down, leaving 8 to reach the high camp. The group dropped 2 more at the 17,200 foot mark when the least experienced guide would stay behind with a healthy client who did not want to attempt the summit, leaving 6 that would make the push. While all members were conditioned and prepared for the climb, the clients heavily relied on the 2 guides to direct and provide instruction up the mountain. On a climb like Mount Denali, many climbers focus solely on the guide in front of them, following behind one step after another. This is particularly the case at high altitudes, when the air becomes thin and the brain begins to slow down. It is the exact reason why there are strict rules and regulations for guides, since they quite literally hold the lives of others in their hands. 57-year-old Staeheli, a strong and fit-built man, was the longest-serving guide for Mount Denali at the time, and was the team leader of the group. He started his career with legendary climber Ray Gannett, and was guiding climbers up the mountain in 1982. In fact, to the locals, he himself is considered an Alaskan legend, after he was the first climber to solo the west rib of Denali in the winter. It is safe to say that he knew better than anyone the risks on the mountain. Since Mount Denali was covered in glaciers, there are slightly more risks than a normal peak. Glaciers are a giant mass of slow-moving ice that are known for having large chunks of rocks fall away, tumbling down the mountain, preparing to take out unexpected climbers. If the dangers from above was not enough, there is an even more sinister danger below your feet. A crevasse is a crack in the ice that can be hundreds of feet deep. Looking over one, you'd be staring at beautiful blue walls leading further down into a black void that will take your breath away and make your heart stop all at once. These were the real dangers of glacier climbing, as falling into one almost always leads to certain death. To protect against this, along with regular falls, the team ascends and descends the mountain with a rope, connected to each member and anchored into pickets. This means if one were to fall into the crevasse, it would be up to the others to dig their spiked boots and ice axes into the snow and brace their bodies along with the prayer that the anchors will hold to stop the fall. Although if the remaining team members are not quick enough on their feet, it would mean the entire group is dragged into the void or down the mountain to their deaths. Ensuring the rope was attached to each member, along with carrying other survival supplies such as a sleeping bag, communication equipment, a shovel, and extra anchors, were the responsibilities of Staeheli and Munter as the guides. On the morning of May 11, 2011, Staeheli would forget to pack a sleeping bag and shovel while he was prepping the group for a busy day and a dangerous climb. It was a very easy mistake in the rush of the early hours of the morning at high altitudes, but it would be a mistake that he would never forget and cost them dearly in the hours to come. The team would set out from the high camp with a long day ahead of them. They would be attached together in groups of 3, 1 guide and 2 climbers, with Staeheli leading the entire group. Up to this point, the group of 8 had made their way up the mountain over the last couple of days with no incidents. In fact, things were going really well, and the group was in good spirits as they had reached the high camp on May 9th. The previous week was spent climbing up the west buttress route of the mountain, stopping at the 3 previous camps along the route to rest before reaching the 4th and final high camp on May 9th. The plan in the morning was to leave the high camp, following the ridge through the Autobahn, a technical and steep area of the route, to Denali Pass. After resting, they would proceed up the pass to the football field at 19,500 feet, which was a large, flat area where climbers could relax before making the final push up Pig Hill, then to the summit. A common saying in mountaineering is that things are going great until they aren't. And to that point, things were going smoothly as the group reached the bottom of Denali Pass. Because of the temperatures, Tony Diskin began to develop frostbite in his hands and had to make the difficult decision to turn around with Munter as his guide and descended back to high camp. This would reduce the group to 4, and more important, Staeheli would have to shepherd the other 3 climbers all attached to 1 rope. Although a seemingly insignificant detail, if there was a fall, this would increase the weight Staeheli would have to brace for and make the expedition significantly more dangerous. They climbed on without incident, reaching the football field after climbing for 9 hours. Cutler was struggling at this point, and it took constant encouragement from Staeheli for him to make it this far. Staeheli gave him the option to wait there for the group to summit and return, but after a short rest, Cutler stood with the others, his face completely determined. He was making the summit, and nobody in the world could stop him. 2 hours later, the group of 4 would take the last couple of steps. 1 step up, then another, then over the ridge. They had reached the summit. Standing on top of the Great One, it really felt like the tallest mountain in North America. As they looked at each other, grinning ear to ear and exchanging high fives, the wind began to pick up, reaching 15 miles per hour. But they did not care, because in those few moments, there was no better feeling in the world. They did not have long to soak in being on top of the world, so after taking a swig of water, they reluctantly put their gear back on, took one last look before taking the first step down the mountain. It took them minutes to reach Pig Hill. They were making good time, and it was needed as the ascent had been a below average pace. The weather was beginning to change for the worst. O'Sullivan was in the middle of the group as they descended Pig's Hill, following Staeheli. Each step from the group was in response to their guide, 1 step following the man in front of you. In the middle of the road, O'Sullivan lifted his foot from the ice as he had done 1,000 times before, but this time was different. This step was different. As he extended his leg to take a step, the crampons, or teeth that were attached to the bottom of his shoes, would catch onto his gaiter, a thick coat of clothing that protected the climber's lower legs, almost like a very large and thick sock that goes on the outside of your clothes. Unpredictable, yet a simple mistake. O'Sullivan tripped. A step that would change the lives of so many. The group had no time to react. In fact, before any of the members even knew what was happening, they were all sliding down the mountain like ragdolls. They were at the mercy of the Great One. After falling about 500 feet, the group stopped in the football field, but the damage was done. O'Sullivan's leg was broken. Staeheli had hit his head during the fall, creating a 4-centimeter gash, leaving him confused and in a daze. He had a few broken ribs, but the most dangerous thing that happened were his fingers, in the early stages of frostbite due to him clawing at the snow throughout the fall in an attempt to slow the group down. Niederer had cracked ribs, and Cutler had strained his back, and at this point the weather had turned for the worse. The winds were picking up significantly by the minute. The four men were quick to realize that this was a worst-case scenario. Staeheli, dazed and fumbling, pulled out his satellite phone and with frostbitten hands began to pull the antenna when, crack, it was broken, and they were now really alone. The four exchanged somber looks. Not a word was said for seconds. Reality set in. In the confusion, Niederer and Cutler began moving across the football field to see if they could get a signal on an old handheld radio or at the very least contact High Camp. While they began the trek, Staeheli moved O'Sullivan into a bivy sack and began dragging him, barely able to hold on to him as he was losing the ability to move his fingers through the thick gloves. One step at a time, pulling with every ounce of energy in his body. Suddenly, the ever-increasing winds blew the bivy sack away, leaving O'Sullivan exposed to the elements. Staeheli did not think. He just continued to drag O'Sullivan, and after 100 yards, he reached the end of the football field. What Staeheli didn't say was that the entire time he was dragging O'Sullivan across that flat area at 19,000 feet, he was thinking that he would not be able to safely bring him down the mountain. He couldn't say it, but he knew that he would have to leave him. With a broken leg and furious winds, with nothing but his clothes to protect him. He should have had a sleeping bag or a shovel that would have provided the ability to build a snow shelter and provide safety from the brutal winds, but Staeheli had not brought those items, so instead he took off his insulated parka and wrapped it around O'Sullivan with a promise to send help. They were just under the summit, and it would be a long trek through the night to reach High Camp. Factor in the time to organize a rescue, and both climbers knew. They both knew as they looked at each other. O'Sullivan did not have the time that it would take, so it was this realization and understanding that Staeheli took one last look before stepping off the football field, turning his head and taking a step down the mountain. Staeheli put himself in serious danger giving up his parka, and knew his only chance was to keep moving in the negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures. Seconds felt like minutes, minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days. It was midnight by the time Staeheli caught up with Cutler and Niederer at the northwest side of Archdeacon's Tower. Staeheli took command and led the group, stating they would descend to Denali Pass, and from there would have Cutler and Niederer shelter themselves while he kept pushing to get help. He stated that if they were to descend down the Autobahn on their own, they would die. Even with his injuries, Staeheli knew this mountain. He had summited tens of times. He knew every second was important, and he descended the mountain like a madman, not only to raise a rescue team, but to keep himself warm. His climbing speed was literally the only thing keeping his body warm enough not to shut down. The group was unroped after the fall, which meant Cutler and Niederer could only follow Staeheli on sight, but he was moving fast, way faster than the other climbers could manage. Cutler followed him as long as he could, and Niederer behind him, until he could see nothing but white landscape and rocks, and every now and then the pickets they had used as anchors on the way up as their only guide down. Staeheli reached Zebra Rock at 18,600 feet and waited for the two climbers there. It took only minutes for Cutler to reach him, but the winds were blowing up to 80 miles an hour at this point, enough to blow any man off of his feet. Both men were cold, brutally cold. Staeheli could wait no longer, and at 1 a.m., after 10 minutes of waiting, he turned his back and began descending. It was every man for themselves, as survival instincts took over. The two men would never see Niederer again. Staeheli was moving too fast for Cutler again, and after reaching Denali Pass, he never let up his pace through the dangerous Autobahn. It was 3:30 a.m. when, with closed fists and black fingers, he stumbled into High Camp, barely able to speak. Staeheli would not have survived another hour. It did not take long for the rescue team to move into action after being notified by assistant guide John McGee, who was at the high camp. Meanwhile, Cutler was at the bottom of Denali Pass and the top of the Autobahn, unsure of his next move. If he was to try his luck down, he was sure he was going to die. But if he stayed, he would freeze to death, at the mercy of the screaming winds and no shelter. He made the impossible decision that he would rather spend his last moments fighting for his life than waiting for help he didn't know would ever come. He took the first step into the Autobahn. It was a hellish descent. The winds and snow had made his surroundings a whiteout, even in the dead of the morning. His only guide was the pickets left behind from the 2010 climbing season, marking the route through the crevasse-littered glacier. At one point, following the small markers blindly, Cutler took the wrong turn, following an old route and nearly stepped into a gaping crack in the ice. He saw nothing but black. Breathing a sigh of relief, he was nearly swallowed by the mountain. He slowly turned around, aware of every step, and retraced his path up the mountain until he found the correct path. Meanwhile, above 19,200 feet on the football field, O'Sullivan had lost Staeheli's parka in the winds. His fingers and toes no longer had any feeling. He did the only thing that he could do. He began to crawl, to not only try to keep whatever warmth he could in his body, but to give him a purpose. He crawled through the 80 miles an hour winds. He crawled all through the night as Staeheli and Cutler descended the mountain. He crawled until his limbs were numb. He crawled until he could no longer pull the weight of his body, his arms and legs limp. He was ready for the end. It was 4:30 a.m. and Cutler was a third of the way down the glacier when he saw the lights bobbing up and down in the distance. At first, he didn't know what he saw. He thought he was dreaming, and then it came to him. McGee and another guide at the high camp had reached Cutler an hour after Staeheli had sent the men into action. Cutler couldn't cry because of the temperatures. He could only keep moving, one step after another, now in the company of others. He was overwhelmed, but did not want to believe that he was going to live. He had made up his mind that he was going to die, and there was nothing that anyone could do or say about that. But now, he was alive. They reached the high camp, and soon Cutler was in a tent, warming his frostbitten limbs. He had made it, even when the man who was to guide them all said he couldn't. The winds were straight out of a nightmare, blowing over the snow walls in the high camp, leaving the tents exposed. They could no longer resume rescue efforts. As the sun rose on a new day, the winds began to subside, and at 9 a.m., the Alaska Air National Guard was airborne. The height they would need to fly was extremely dangerous, but if anyone was still alive, they were the only hope. There would be no ground rescue. At 9:16 a.m., the C-130 Hercules spotted a man on the football field, a trail of his body stretching 800 feet through the snow behind him. He had crawled over 800 feet off the path through the snow and ice to a rock outcropping that had protected him from the wind. The team took note and minutes later found another man near Denali Pass. Neither men were moving, and the crew could do nothing but wait for the weather to further subside to attempt to rescue. They made several attempts to reach O'Sullivan through the day, but nothing was working. An Alaskan Ranger Erickson suggested they perform a short haul. This is when the group would hang a rope attached to a harness and basket below the chopper. The issue is, nobody would be able to descend, so it would be up to O'Sullivan, if he was still alive, to strap himself in and climb into the basket, then hang below the aircraft. It was their only option, and at 7 p.m. on May 12th, the team would fly out again to the football field with the harness and rope dangling from the bottom of the aircraft. O'Sullivan, lying on his back, saw the chopper fly over him. In fact, he had seen it multiple times throughout the day, but this was different. He could see the basket. It was set in the snow near him. He could no longer feel his legs or arms, but he knew that this was his only chance. He somehow willed himself, wiggling his body towards safety. He doesn't recall exactly how he got in, but he did. Then he was in the air, free from the mountain, a feeling he would never forget. While O'Sullivan flew overhead, Ranger Wright was making his way up Denali Pass to the last remaining man on the mountain. It was not long before he reached Niederer. His face was slumped, and Wright knew that he had not made it through the night. He was hunched over in the fetal position, trying to shelter as best as he could as he was instructed to do so. He had frozen to death on the mountain. O'Sullivan survived the mountain. They had all survived, except for Niederer, who gave his life that day. O'Sullivan would lose all of his fingers, both thumbs, and part of one foot because of frostbite. Staeheli would lose the tips of all of his fingers as well. In the aftermath, a lot of blame was put on Staeheli, but he was faced with impossible decisions and made choices that he thought were the best in the moment. There were strict regulation changes regarding the necessary gear for guides up the mountain after the incident. Niederer gave his life on that mountain after reaching the summit. He saw the world as very few have, the harsh reality, yet reward of the Great One.